Frank Delacroix retired in the spring of 2022. He had worked 31 years for a regional trucking and logistics company outside Columbus, Ohio, moving up from dispatcher to operations manager. He had a modest pension, a paid-off house, and a 401k that looked on paper like enough. 18 months later, he was back behind a counter at an auto parts store 3 days a week, not because he missed the smell of diesel exhaust, but because his property tax bill had gone up almost 40% in 2 years. His homeowner's insurance premium had jumped again after a round of severe weather claims in his county, and the number in his brokerage account no longer matched the number he had built his plan around. Frank is not an isolated case study. He is one data point in a pattern that government surveys and private research are now describing as one of the more revealing shifts in the American retirement experience. Retirement is no longer functioning, for a growing share of people, as a permanent exit from paid work. It is functioning as a pause. For most of the last century, retirement in the United States carried a simple promise. You worked for decades, you paid into Social Security, you contributed to a pension or a savings plan if your employer offered one, and at some agreed-upon age, you stopped. The stopping was the point. It was the reward for 4 decades of showing up. What is changing now is not that people dislike this idea. Surveys consistently show that most retirees still want to stop working permanently if they can. What is changing is whether the math still allows it. According to research from AARP conducted with NORC at the University of Chicago, roughly 6 to 7% of retirees over 50 said in late 2025 and early 2026 surveys that they had returned to the labor force within the previous 6 months. That number has held steady rather than spiking, which matters because it tells us this is not a temporary blip tied to one bad month of inflation data. It is a durable feature of the current retirement landscape. Separate research from Resume Builder, surveying thousands of Americans over 65, found that close to 1 in 8 retirees between 65 and 85 said they were likely to rejoin the workforce in 2026, on top of the fifth or so of seniors already working. 4 in 10 of those already working seniors said they had been retired once before. Retirement for them was not a single door that closed. It was a door that opened, closed, and opened again. The reasons people give for walking back through that door are worth sitting with, because they are not vague or emotional. They are specific. In the AARP research, close to half of people who unretired said the primary reason was financial necessity or a bleak personal outlook on the economy. Not boredom, not restlessness, money. A separate survey from U.S. Bank found that nearly 2/3 of Americans worry they may eventually have to return to work after retiring, and only a little over half believe their savings will actually last as long as they need them to. That is not a minority of anxious outliers. That is a majority of the country quietly rehearsing, in the back of their minds, the possibility that their retirement will not be permanent. To understand why, you have to look at what a retiree's income is actually built from, and how that foundation has shifted underneath people who did nothing wrong. The average retired worker receiving Social Security gets a little over $2,000 a month. Benefits rose by 2.8% heading into 2026, a cost of living adjustment intended to keep pace with inflation. But in one recent survey, more than 2/3 of retirees said that adjustment was not enough to cover their actual grocery, utility, and medical bills. Social Security was never designed to be a full replacement for a working income. It was designed as a floor, one leg of what used to be called a 3-legged stool, alongside a pension and personal savings. For a large share of today's retirees, the pension leg simply is not there. Traditional defined benefit pensions have been disappearing from the private sector for decades, replaced by 401k plans that put both the contribution and the investment risk on the worker. That shift looked fine during a long bull market. It looks very different when a retiree needs to draw down that account during a period of high prices, high interest rates, and health costs rising faster than almost anything else in the household budget. And healthcare is where the arithmetic gets genuinely brutal. Fidelity Investments, which has published an annual retiree healthcare cost estimate for over 2 decades, found that a single 65-year-old retiring in 2025 could expect to spend an average of $172,500 out of pocket on healthcare over the rest of their life. For a married couple retiring together, that figure was roughly $345,000. And that number does not include long-term care. A private room in a nursing home carried a median annual cost of over $129,000 in 2025. None of this is covered automatically by Medicare, and Fidelity's own research found that more than half of pre-retirees mistakenly believe Medicare will cover most or all of their healthcare needs once they leave the workforce. It will not. Roughly half of the average retiree's lifetime medical spending comes from cost sharing, co-pays, coinsurance, deductibles. Another large share comes from monthly premiums for Medicare parts and supplemental coverage that most people did not budget for with any precision, because for most of their working lives, an employer handled that math quietly in the background. So picture the actual mechanics of a household like Frank's. A worker retires with what looks like a reasonable nest egg, calculated against a rule of thumb from a financial planning brochure written years earlier, when healthcare inflation was running closer to general inflation instead of consistently outpacing it. The retiree begins drawing down that account for ordinary living expenses. Then a dental problem requires an implant Medicare does not cover. Then a knee needs an MRI, and the deductible resets. Then a hurricane season or a wildfire season pushes the regional insurance market into recalculating risk, and a homeowner's premium rises by hundreds of dollars a year, sometimes with no warning beyond a renewal notice. None of these events is unusual. None of them is a crisis by itself. But stacked together, over 3 or 4 years, they quietly erode the cushion a retirement plan was built on, until the retiree is doing the same math Frank did. Not, can I afford one more vacation? But, how many more years does this money actually need to last, and does the current withdrawal rate get me there? This is where the second layer of the story becomes visible, because the pressure is not only about rising costs. It is about how fragile the income side of a retiree's plan has become. A worker who leaves a full-time job at 62 or 65 is not simply choosing not to work. In many cases, they are also choosing to walk away from employer-sponsored health insurance, which for people not yet eligible for Medicare creates its own gap that has to be bridged privately, often at significant cost. If they draw Social Security before reaching full retirement age while still earning money from any part-time job, an earnings test kicks in. In 2025, earnings above roughly $1,950 a month reduced benefits by $1 for every $2 earned above that line. That rule does not apply once someone reaches full retirement age, but it shapes decisions for people trying to work part-time in their early 60s, sometimes discouraging the very bridge employment that could ease the transition. And for retirees who have already started required minimum distributions from retirement accounts, going back to work does not pause those mandatory withdrawals. It stacks new wage income directly on top of them, pushing some retirees into a higher tax bracket than they experienced during their working years, at the exact moment they can least afford the surprise. None of this happens to people who behaved recklessly. Frank did not buy a boat. He did not carry credit card debt. He followed the guidance he was given. Pay off the house, contribute to the 401k, retire around 65. The guidance was not wrong when it was written. It has simply not kept pace with how fast healthcare costs, insurance costs, and property costs have moved relative to the income sources retirees actually have. There is a labor market dimension to this story too, and it cuts in an unexpected direction. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has projected that labor force participation among workers 65 to 74 would reach just over 30% by 2026, compared with a little under 18% in 1996. For workers 75 and older, participation is projected to more than double over the same period, from under 5% to close to 11%. That is not a small statistical drift. That is a structural change in who is in the American workforce, driven by a mix of longer life expectancy, better health at older ages, and, for a meaningful share of these workers, financial pressure that simply did not exist for their parents' generation at the same age. But here is the reframe worth sitting with, because the story is not simply that older Americans are broke and desperate. Some economists studying this pattern point out something more complicated. The labor market retirees are trying to re-enter is not the labor market they left. During the tight post-pandemic job market of 2021 and 2022, a retiree looking for part-time or bridge work had real leverage. Employers were short-staffed and willing to be flexible about hours, remote arrangements, or reduced schedules. That window has narrowed. Hiring has cooled, and older job seekers now report running into a much harder version of ageism than they expected, competing for fewer open positions against younger candidates in an economy generating fewer net new jobs than it was 3 or 4 years ago. One labor economist who studies this population put it plainly. A few years ago, there were rising costs and a lot of jobs. Now there are rising costs and not many jobs. That combination is what turns unretirement from a flexible option into something closer to a trap. The retiree needs income. The economy is not reliably supplying the kind of part-time, dignified, appropriately paid work that would solve the problem cleanly. Education becomes a dividing line here in a way that deserves honesty rather than euphemism. Retirees with college degrees have a meaningfully easier time re-entering paid work, whether through consulting, part-time professional roles, or flexible arrangements with former employers. Retirees without a 4-year degree are more often funneled into retail, food service, or warehouse-adjacent roles. Physically demanding jobs, often at wages barely above what they were making decades earlier when adjusted for the cost of living, in workplaces not designed around the needs of a 70-year-old body. The median income of retired Americans sits under $30,000 a year, according to research cited by economist Teresa Ghilarducci, which is precisely why, for many, work is the only realistic lever left to pull. Cutting expenses further is not always an option when the expenses in question are property taxes, prescription drugs, and insurance premiums that keep climbing regardless of how carefully a household budgets. Geography adds another layer that a national average conceals almost entirely. A retiree who bought a modest home in a small Midwestern city in the 1990s at a fixed-rate mortgage that has long since been paid off is in an entirely different position than a retiree in a coastal metro area facing property values, insurance costs, and cost of living pressures that have outpaced wage growth for decades. Retirees in states with rapidly rising homeowners' insurance premiums, driven by increased wildfire, hurricane, or flood risk, are seeing a specific and largely unavoidable line-item balloon, regardless of how disciplined they are about everything else. A retiree in a low-cost rural county might be able to stretch the same Social Security check that leaves someone in a high-cost suburb hundreds of dollars short every month. This is not a story where one number describes the country. It is a story where the same benefit check produces wildly different outcomes depending on a zip code the retiree may have chosen 30 years earlier for reasons that had nothing to do with what insurance markets or housing costs would look like in 2026. Family dynamics complicate the picture further, and this is where the psychological weight of the trend becomes visible. Many people in the 50 to 75 age range are not only managing their own retirement uncertainty, they are also, simultaneously, providing financial or logistical support to adult children who cannot yet afford independent housing, while beginning to manage the needs of their own aging parents, who may be entering a stage requiring in-home care or assisted living that the family did not fully plan for. A person who unretires at 68 is sometimes doing so not purely to fund their own expenses, but because a daughter needed help with a security deposit, or a father-in-law needed a home health aide 3 days a week that Medicare did not fully cover. The math of one retirement plan is rarely isolated anymore. It is embedded in a web of family obligations running in both directions at once, and going back to work becomes one of the only levers a person in that position has to pull that does not involve asking someone else in the family to sacrifice something. There is a quieter psychological cost running underneath all of this that surveys capture only partially. People who spent 30 or 40 years building toward a specific, socially understood version of retirement, the version where you finally stop, often describe a real sense of disorientation when they find themselves filling out a job application again in their late 60s. Some describe genuine embarrassment explaining to adult children or former colleagues why they are back at work. Others describe the opposite reaction, relief at having structure and purpose again, alongside guilt that the reason they needed that structure was financial rather than purely personal choice. Research on this population finds a meaningful minority who say boredom or a desire to stay socially connected played a role in their decision to return to work, and it would be dishonest to pretend every unretirement story is a financial emergency. Some retirees genuinely found that stopping entirely did not suit them, and going back on their own terms, in a job they chose rather than one they were locked into for decades, has been a net improvement in their quality of life. That nuance matters. Not every 68-year-old greeting customers at a hardware store is there, because they have no other option. But when nearly half of the people surveyed about their return to work cite financial necessity or a bad economic outlook as the primary driver, and when a majority of near retirees admit they are not confident their money will last, the honest reading of the data is that necessity, not restlessness, is doing most of the driving at the national level. It is worth pausing on the distinction between genuine structural pressure and simple lifestyle inflation, because not every unretirement story fits the same mold, and pretending otherwise would flatten a complicated picture. Some retirees who return to work do so after decades of carrying larger mortgages than their income comfortably supported, financing vehicles well beyond what a fixed retirement income could sustain, or maintaining a standard of living that assumed the stock market would keep climbing indefinitely. For that group, the honest explanation involves choices made along the way, not simply forces acting upon them. But the healthcare, insurance, and property tax pressures described here are a different category entirely. A retiree cannot negotiate down a Medicare Part B premium. A homeowner in a wildfire-prone county cannot simply decide that insurance rates should rise more slowly. A retiree whose required minimum distribution pushes them into a higher tax bracket the moment they take a part-time job did not create that rule. These are fixed structural costs that behave the same way, regardless of how carefully a household manages its discretionary spending, and no amount of clipped coupons or canceled streaming subscriptions closes a gap measured in tens of thousands of dollars. Consider, for contrast, a household in a different circumstance. A married couple in a fast-growing Sunbelt metro area, both recently retired from public sector jobs that included a modest pension, something increasingly rare outside government employment. On paper, they look considerably more secure than Frank. But their region has seen home insurance premiums roughly double over 5 years as insurers reassess flood and wind risk, and their property tax bill has climbed alongside a local real estate boom that priced in rapid population growth. Their pension, fixed at the amount calculated when they retired, does not adjust for any of this. Within 3 years, a couple who believed a pension made them the exception to the unretirement trend found themselves running the same math as everyone else. Could a part-time consulting arrangement or a few shifts at a local business close the gap between a fixed income and costs that refuse to hold still? Their pension delayed the reckoning. It did not eliminate it. The ripple effects of this pressure move outward from individual households into the small businesses and communities that depend on confident retiree spending. Retirees have historically been a stable source of demand for local restaurants, home services, travel bookings, and discretionary retail, precisely because they were assumed to have predictable income and free time. When a meaningful share of that population instead spends its available hours working part-time shifts to cover healthcare deductibles, that predictable spending pattern weakens. Regional economies built around retiree communities, from small Florida towns to Mountain West retirement destinations, are beginning to notice the difference in slower demand for the services that once assumed a leisure-class customer base. This is not a dramatic collapse. It is a quiet redirection of both time and money away from consumption and toward covering fixed costs, repeated across enough households to show up in local business revenue. Returning to Frank's situation makes the mechanism concrete rather than abstract. In the 2 years after his 2022 retirement, his property tax bill rose sharply as his county reassessed home values amid a regional housing boom he had nothing to do with. His homeowner's insurance renewal arrived with a premium increase he had no ability to negotiate, tied to a statewide pattern of insurers repricing risk after a string of severe weather years. His retirement account, drawn down at the rate his financial advisor had modeled years earlier, began falling behind that model once healthcare costs rose faster than the plan anticipated and a knee replacement required a deductible and follow-up physical therapy Medicare covered only partially. None of these were unusual events. None of them, individually, would have forced him back to work. Stacked together over roughly 18 months, they moved him from a household confident it had planned correctly to a household quietly recalculating whether the original plan still held. The auto parts job did not appear because Frank wanted a project. It appeared because 3 ordinary, unremarkable cost increases arrived in the same 18-month window, and the only lever he had left to pull that did not involve selling the house was his own labor. The reframe that sits at the center of this story is this. The traditional idea of retirement as a single, permanent, one-way threshold, something you cross once and never cross back over, was always somewhat aspirational. For much of the 20th century, it worked reasonably well for workers who had stable pensions, employer-sponsored retiree health coverage, and healthcare costs that rose roughly in line with everything else. Almost none of those 3 conditions holds broadly today. What has changed is not that Americans suddenly became worse at saving. What changed is the floor underneath retirement got less stable at almost exactly the moment healthcare costs, housing costs, and insurance costs accelerated past what previous financial planning assumptions accounted for. Retirement did not become optional. It became conditional, subject to renegotiation any time a major cost category moves faster than a fixed income can absorb. Generational contrast sharpens the picture further. A retiree who bought a home in the early 1980s or 1990s, financed a mortgage at rates that later fell, and paid it off well before retirement is carrying a housing cost burden that bears almost no resemblance to what a retiree who purchased more recently is facing. That older buyer's fixed monthly cost is often limited to property tax and insurance, both of which can still rise sharply, but neither of which comes close to a mortgage payment. A retiree who bought later, closer to the 2008 downturn, or during the run-up in prices over the past several years, may still be carrying a mortgage into their 60s or 70s, layering a housing payment directly on top of the same healthcare and insurance pressures everyone else is facing. Two retirees with an identical Social Security benefit and comparable savings can end up in entirely different financial positions purely because of when, geographically and historically, they happen to buy a home. This is part of why national statistics about retirement confidence can feel almost meaningless to any individual household. The average obscures two very different lived experiences sitting on either side of it. Consider a second representative worker, a woman in her early 60s named Rosa, a former school administrative assistant in a mid-sized Texas city, who took Social Security at 62 because a corporate downsizing ended her job 2 years earlier than she planned. Drawing benefits before her full retirement age means she is subject to the earnings test. In 2025, any income above roughly $1,950 a month reduces her benefit by $1 for every $2 earned above that threshold. When a part-time bookkeeping opportunity came up, paying enough to meaningfully help with her bills, she discovered that a significant portion of the extra income would simply offset a reduction in her Social Security check, at least until she reaches full retirement age, when the rule no longer applies and any withheld amounts are gradually credited back. The math is not irrational, and the benefits are not truly lost forever, but it creates a genuine disincentive in the years when many retirees most need flexible bridge income, discouraging exactly the kind of part-time work that could otherwise ease the transition rather than forcing an all-or-nothing choice between full retirement and full-time employment. What responses exist, and what do they actually solve? Some retirees are using part-time bridge jobs, often with former employers or in adjacent industries, to smooth the transition rather than stopping abruptly. This works well for people with marketable professional skills and flexible employers willing to offer reduced schedules, but it is largely unavailable to people in physically demanding trades where there is no lighter version of the job to phase into. Some households are restructuring around multi-generational living, with adult children and aging parents sharing a single property to reduce the total number of housing payments a family must sustain. This can meaningfully reduce costs, but it also concentrates caregiving responsibilities, reduces privacy, and can create friction that a purely financial calculation does not capture. Delaying Social Security claims until full retirement age or later increases the eventual monthly benefit substantially, but it requires either continued earnings or an existing cushion large enough to bridge the gap, which is precisely the resource many of the people considering unretirement do not have. Health savings accounts, when available during working years, offer a meaningful tax-advantaged way to prepare for the healthcare costs. Fidelity's research quantifies so starkly, but they require years of contribution before retirement to make a real dent, which does little for someone already at the threshold. Relocating to a lower-cost region can free up real money, particularly for homeowners with substantial equity, but it also means leaving behind a support network, a familiar healthcare provider, and often, the very children and grandchildren the retiree may be trying to stay close to in the first place. None of these are false solutions. All of them are real trade-offs, available unevenly, solving part of the problem while creating a different one somewhere else in the household. What this trend ultimately redefines is the meaning of the word retirement itself, at least as a lived experience rather than a legal or administrative status. For a growing share of Americans in their 60s and 70s, retirement is no longer the finish line it was advertised as for most of their working lives. It is closer to an extended, renegotiable phase, one that can include full withdrawal from the workforce, partial withdrawal, a return to work driven by necessity, and a return to work driven by choice, sometimes all within the same decade, sometimes within the same year. The financial planning industry is beginning to adjust its own language to reflect this, talking less about a single retirement date and more about a retirement transition that can run for years and bend in either direction depending on markets, health, and unexpected costs. Frank Delacroix still calls himself retired. He also still works 3 shifts a week behind that auto parts counter, and he has stopped apologizing for it to the neighbors who ask. What he has come to understand, and what a growing number of people his age are learning at roughly the same pace, is that the promise he built his working life around, the promise that 30 years of steady contribution would purchase a permanent stop, was never quite as fixed as it looked from the outside. The real question this trend leaves behind is not whether any individual retiree did enough to prepare. It is whether a retirement system built on pensions that mostly no longer exist, healthcare costs that keep outrunning every projection, and a social security benefit designed as a supplement rather than a salary, can still deliver the one thing it was always supposed to deliver, an ending that actually stays ended.